on today, wherever you may be presenting from or listening in and tuning in from. We acknowledge the traditional territory upon which the conference is being hosted for many thousands of years. The Huron-Wendat, Petun First Nations, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit, have sought to walk gently on this land. This territory is covered with Treaty 13, the Mississaugas of Credit, as well as by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and an allied nations that peacefully share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. This acknowledgement signals our desire to seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, and one that's based on honor and deep respect, and is a starting point to remind us all to enact this work in our personal and professional lives. So welcome everyone. In just a moment, I want to introduce our speaker, but I need to change screens. Okay, so welcome. We've got Abhay Singh Sachal on the call. He's going to be presenting Fostering Environmental Empathy and Youth Involvement, telling us about the Break the Divide. After traveling to the Arctic, Abhay co-founded Break the Divide Foundation, a nonprofit that fosters environmental empathy through connection. Abhay has been a key presenter at numerous conferences to share environmental knowledge. Abhay was recently named one of Canada's top 25 under 25 environmentalists. Welcome, Abhay, and thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful introduction, Karen, and for the great land acknowledgement. I think it's critical that we all think of the land that we're on. So I'm currently in Surrey, BC, on the West Coast, although I'm a student at the University of Toronto, and I'm on the unceded traditional territory of the Tsawwassen, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coast Salish peoples here. And once again, it's great to be here chatting from BC. And I'm just going to share my slides right here. And it is great to see some familiar names. I guess I can't say faces in the Zoom chat today. And just a confirmation that you can all see this all right.
Yeah, and actually, you know what? I did forget to mention that this session is going to be recorded, Abhay, and I know that you and Georgia and I checked in with you about that. But if there's anybody that's on the call that would not like to be recorded during this session today, just a reminder to keep your cameras off. Sorry to interrupt you.
No worries. Wonderful. I'm ready to get started here. And so the session is going to be around like 35 minutes, but I'm really happy to answer any questions throughout the way. I'm just really here to share my story as a young climate activist, the sorts of works that I've done, especially in terms of education and what I've seen, the ways that climate action and climate education comes together and can drive youth action. And I guess I'll start with a bit about myself and my story. I've grown up here in BC, and I have some of the most vivid memories of being a young person. Being 4 or 5 years old and going out into the forest here in BC with my dad, being in like the rain, seeing all the greenery, and it's just a really good memory and really good memories that I have of myself being with nature. I remember connecting with nature and just having an extraordinary time doing that. And so this is me in 2016. I was 14 years old, a lot younger, still as happy, less facial here actually. Um, and I traveled to the Canadian Arctic through the Students on Ice Foundation. And so Mike Jensen is on this call right now. Mike was one of my mentors, one of the program chaperones, the teachers there on this expedition for me. And again, I was very young at this time, and I learned so much on this Arctic expedition through the Students on Ice Foundation. So I was in the Arctic for 2 weeks and going up from Ottawa to Iqaluit, sailing down the coast of Labrador up to Greenland. I mean, an incredible time. And for me, again, I had come into this expedition thinking that I was going to learn about climate change. And that's it. I actually remember telling people that I was going to learn how to solve climate change before going to this expedition. I remember seeing these beautiful sceneries from the glaciers and the beautiful ice of the Arctic to the beautiful people there. I went swimming in the Arctic Ocean, and as you can tell in this photo, I'm having a ton of fun. We went kayaking and paddleboarding, and again, at 14 years old, this was the journey of a lifetime. It was absolutely incredible being in this place, seeing polar bears, seeing the beauty of the Arctic. And beyond that, though, I remember meeting new friends, and I met a lot of Inuit friends, and they told me about the challenges that their communities have faced. Um, I remember, so there's this one moment actually that's very distinct in my memory at the Ilulissat Ice Fjord in Greenland. This is a place where you can see ice stretched out for kilometers and kilometers, as far as your eye can see. And in the Aleutian Ice Field, at this place, all 200 of us at the expedition, we came together and we went silent for a moment. And in that silence, we could hear the ice melting. So it was millions of drops of the purest water on the planet going into the freshest body of water that exists. And I remember that moment being incredible for me. But beyond that, I was kind of inundated with this feeling of joy, but also hopelessness. This idea that if climate change and the climate crisis is this bad, there's nothing I could do to make a difference. And I remember dealing and thinking about these emotions for a while. Um, but as I talked to my Inuit friends in the Arctic, I talked to them about their communities and climate change in their communities. And uh, I learned how climate change has been impacting communities in the Arctic for decades now, not just years, but decades. And learning about the strength and resilience of those communities in the face of the climate crisis, but beyond that, in face of the harms of colonialism, for example, that was inspiring for me. And it really made me realize that the reason that I was connected to these issues now, the reason that I cared so much was because of that personal connection that I had, was because I was connected to the environment and to the people of the Arctic. And I understood climate change on a more personal level now. No longer was it about a 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius change that some people in Europe were talking about. It was my own communities. It was people that I knew, and it was my own country. Um, and so coming back, I remember talking a lot about this idea of connection. And I thought, what if I connected the communities up in the Arctic, my high school actually, with students up in the Arctic? And so that's my older brother right here. He actually had the opportunity to travel to the Arctic. And he actually lived in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories for 6 months. He spent some time there as a teacher. And what we set up was a simple video call session between my high school here in Delta, BC, and East 3 Secondary in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. And in this conversation, it was just incredible to see students learn about each other. Again, I think back to this in 2016. I like to say I was using Zoom calls way before it was cool to do so. And in this Zoom call, in this simple video call session, students at my high school just learned a ton about community, our new friends in the North. We became friends, and that was so powerful. We learned about how melting permafrost was having an impact on their community. And likewise, they learned about some of the impacts of climate change in our community. We talked about forest fires and the smoke that comes up in BC. This past September, when smoke was across Canada from the California wildfires. And in this process, I would really say that we learned about each other, that we fostered empathy, and through this process, as friends, we were able to openly have dialogue about things like climate change, about the mental health concerns that we all faced, and about truth and reconciliation. Students in my high school learned about residential schools from the perspective of students themselves that were willing to share. And that was just powerful to see, because a lot of students in the Arctic reached out to me after, saying that these conversations were very sort of cathartic for them. Like they were able to share and learn from one another. And so we started this organization called Break the Divide. And the idea was simple. It was to break the divide between the students in the North and students in the South, make sure that we were opening up relationships, not extractive knowledge taking away from the community, but relationships between the two communities. So this really led us to the question, climate change, mental health, and empathy. Like, how do these things connect? And what does it mean in the real world to have climate change knowledge, but empathy, especially as it relates to mental health? And that's kind of where I want to take the discussion for the presentation today. What is climate? Like, how do you better understand climate change? How does it relate to mental health? And how does empathy fit into all of this? And so I'd love to have a group discussion on this. I really want this session to be conversational, all of us chatting with each other. Uh, and I'm just looking at the chat right now. I saw a few things pop up. Perfect. So as we talk about climate change, mental health, and empathy, I'd love to hear everyone's comments. I might stop sharing my screen so I can see either hands raised or any emojis on the Zoom function. But essentially, when we talk about climate change, mental health, and empathy, One thing that we were able to do effectively at Break the Divide in these conversations that we did was this idea of connection, and connection beyond a traditional means. Like when we talk about the education system, and I know a lot of you are educators here. As a student growing up, I remember learning about communities in the Arctic, for example, or Indigenous communities in Canada through my textbooks. And as a non-Indigenous student, I remember just not being very connected to the issues. And I know a lot of this has changed since I was in high school. 3 years, as early as 3 years ago, there have been major education changes that have been for the positive. But I remember being in high school, and I remember distinctly in grade 8 learning about like different Indigenous peoples, different nations in Canada. But I remember being very disconnected with with what I was learning about. Like I remember feeling very bored and not caring about the education at all. And as someone who cared about high school, who was very engaged, I remember talking to my other friends, and they said that they were also bored, especially during those units. Whenever a math teacher or science teacher tried to just jam some Indigenous perspective into what we were learning without any context or any understanding of the broader concepts that we were talking about, I struggled with understanding that, and it was harmful to my education and my understanding of Indigenous peoples, and the, sort of the relationships between truth and reconciliation, and what we did in Canada. So one thing that we were able to do then in Break the Divide is make it voluntary. Uh, we allowed students the opportunity to join this club, and we pitched it as this way for students to just learn about another people. It wasn't about like climate change or mental health or reconciliation. It was about learning from other people. And students showed up. And in these conversations, then there was no really guide to where the conversations would go. And I think that process was very helpful for students being able to just learn about each other, to understand who other people are. And like the conversations began with these basic connections where students were talking about what Netflix shows they like to watch together, or what they did for fun. And over time, as they built those personal connections, they were able to do so much more and talk about those deeper topics that we discussed earlier. Um, and I think that process was very powerful. And I think that's one of the that's one of the powerful things that we saw in Break the Divide. The idea of fostering empathy, like learning about another person from another place when you're in high school, so that through these connections, you can do something greater. You can work together on these community issues. So, long story short, through Break the Divide, beyond that initial connection between the schools in the North and South, we expanded to schools in different, and in those connections we were able to do a lot more, like foster empathy in a broader context. I'm just going to take a second here, stop sharing, and look at the chat. I see a few messages. So Danica says, is participation in your program voluntary, and uh, how do real people who deny climate change or feel, how do you deal with people who deny climate change or feel it's unimportant? And so this is a very important question. No worries, reach people. Okay, perfect. Um, and so yes, the participation in the program is voluntary. It's at most high schools, we reach out to students or teachers. And I'd love for teachers here to take on Break the Divide and uh, facilitate these connections. And we can chat about that later. But we reach out to students or teachers, or they reach out to us. And we set up clubs at these high schools where students just come together. Before COVID, it was obviously like a weekly club meeting or something like that. And now it's like obviously totally virtual, and we're moving away from that place-based model to allow any students to come in these settings to connect. And the question about reaching people who deny climate change or feel that it's unimportant is such an important one. Because what we found through some of our conversations, as we've connected some students in Toronto and Ottawa with students in the Arctic, for example, one thing that we saw was a lot of students felt a lot of apathy about the climate crisis. They felt like they couldn't do anything as an individual, so it wasn't worth thinking or trying to change it at all. Another response was increased polarization. Like as students were met with perspectives that differed from theirs, uh, they took a political side and said that, well, climate change can't be real because I heard someone say that it wasn't, or that and Danica, what you had in the chat was about about the idea of denial about climate change, who feel that it's not real. That was a very prevalent response. And what we saw happen was when our students from different areas, whether it's BC or the Arctic, or even like different areas in the world where we've connected students like Bolivia and Russia, when these students became friends first and then came together on a person-to-person basis, they were talking about their own experiences. And the students that may not have been that understanding of climate change, they learned, and they didn't necessarily change their perspectives completely. They didn't start becoming climate activists the next day. But what I think happened was the students started to understand that maybe it's not like a big issue. Maybe climate change is something that's happening in their community. And that in itself, I saw as a very positive step, because they started thinking about climate change in very concrete terms, and they related it to things like Indigenous rights, like mental health. And that was very powerful in that process. And so reaching people who deny climate change, I think that's such an important part of programming like this, because we need to have empathy for people that may not understand the climate crisis. And obviously people with good intentions and good faith in these conversations, that's absolutely critical. Um, and Betsy, I really appreciate the comment. I think absolutely, like Break the Divide really is about social justice education, combining with sustainability and bringing these things together. Empathy and understanding overlap with one another, and relationships. And really the foundation of these relationships is trust. It's about providing that fertile soil to not control how students do build that relationship. Thank you so much. Very well said. I might use that on the website. Like, that is beautifully said. Uh, and so the program is available to elementary students. We're trying to work with anywhere from grade 5 to 7 students right now. But we'd love to chat more and like build those programs in. So I'm going to continue with my slides so we can talk a bit more about empathy. I appreciate the questions throughout. I think it really does give a really good conversational lens to this this entire presentation. So as I continue sharing, again, like, there's nothing groundbreaking that I saw initially with this conversation. It's just a Zoom call between students, but providing that space and allowing for, and what we've done in the past now, as of more recently, is create resources for students about how to have good conversations so that they have the tools in place and they can build the relationships as they see fit. So it really is like an electronic pen pal system. So I'm going to keep sharing, and I hope we can continue this conversation. So one of the things that I often think about is the connection between climate change and mental health. And I'll give a brief example here. When I was in the Arctic, like I talked about that moment at the Ilulissat ice fjord, I was quite hopeless in that moment, thinking about climate change and what I could do. I also mentioned the wildfires in BC, but to build on that, like this past September of 2020, I was starting my second year at U of T, and I was kind of bummed out. I was at home. I wasn't going back to Toronto because of COVID. I had an awesome first year being on campus, and I lamented not being able to have that. But I remember being at home, and it was the first week of school. So I thought, okay, you know what? I'll get my life together. I'll go for a run outside at least. But it was a Monday morning, and I remember looking outside, and there was smoke everywhere. Not even just in the sky, there was smoke everywhere. And I couldn't go outside. And that was because of the California wildfires and the smoke that had come up to BC, and Vancouver having the worst air quality in the world at that time. And again, in that experience, I felt hopelessness again, especially as I thought about climate change. I felt like I couldn't do anything substantive to make a difference. I felt like it was all pointless. And again, as someone who is engaged in climate activism, having those emotions was alarming, but I really felt like I should work through them. So I would love to have a bit of a discussion here where we can chat about our experiences with climate change and mental health. Feel free to message in the chat or unmute yourself. I'd love to ask everyone, how has your mental health been impacted by climate change? What have you seen recently? And I'd love to hear any personal examples or specific examples from the past, if anyone would be able to share.
Hi, this is Elizabeth from Regina. Um, I'd like to share an experience. I was working with a provincial group early in the 2000, 2001. I think that's maybe before you were even born. And I was very worried because I'd adopted children, and I was really worried what was going to happen in the future for them. In fact, I couldn't sleep at night about it. I had the opportunity uh, to go with my husband. He was attending a conference in Phoenix, Arizona. And when I was there, yeah, I was going to go shopping, but I didn't because at first I'd been told by a friend to check out the botanical gardens. So I thought, yeah, well, I'll check in on it so I can say, yeah, I saw it, and then I'll go shopping. Anyway, I spent the entire day at the botanical gardens. And the most moving thing for me was the desert house. And it had been built to accommodate the climate that they were experiencing. And it had systems for collecting gray water. It had a very small grassed space, so they wouldn't have to use very much water. They used the traditional architecture of the area, the ramadas, which are the structures, what we might call a gazebo here in Regina, that has wooden slats on top so that the heat will go out, but the sun, you're shaded from the direct sun so that the air will move and you have a shaded outdoor area for doing things. They had raised planting containers where you could maximize the water you had for watering your vegetables without a lot of water loss. And I realized at that point that, and I looked more into it, we already have the technology to adapt to climate change. I realized that people have lived in all kinds of climates. Yes, there are things, and that gave me hope. And once I had hope, then I was able to continue working forward in environmental education, um, trying to help in my own way and I work with Project Wet Canada, which has to do with water education across Canada. But I'm still here. I mean, I should have been retired some time back, but I'm still here and still working part-time because it's important. And so that was a pivotal moment for me to see the desert house and to realize that if we changed our building codes, if we changed the way we behave, then we can make things work. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Elizabeth. I really appreciate it, that perspective. And to answer your question, yes, I was born in 2001. Um, and I, I'm looking at the comments in the chat right now and hearing what you all as educators have to say. Like the ability to teach climate change to students and that helplessness that you experience. And I know students and young people experience a lot of that helplessness as well. But Elizabeth, you put it beautifully, like the solutions are there. And for students, what I've always seen as one of the things that we need to do is empower students with that resilience and that hope. And beyond that, and ultimately the skills that they'll need to be able to enact that change and be a part of that positive change. It is overwhelming, and I love the discussion in the chat right now. Like that there is hope, and I may be preaching to the choir here, but as I present to students, and I've presented to a lot of students over the past year, so many have talked about like that anxiety that they face, that they're worried because of climate change. And going back to the idea of break the divide, one thing that we've tried to do is provide a space as well for students to have that conversation specifically about climate change and mental health. We saw that there wasn't that sort of space beforehand. And with that sort of space, what we really want to be doing is making sure that people are open to share, making sure that people can be themselves and not be forced into this idea of hope either. Not being, not having this toxic positivity that like everything will work out, but recognizing the reality of the situation and then working with community members, understanding what they can do and building on that sort of systemic change that's needed. Is there anyone else that would like to share I mean, how climate change has impacted you. I see a lot of amazing notes in the chat here.
Something, oh, Jasmine, you go first, and then I'll
Oh,
add my comment. Go for it.
Sure. I was just going to say, just adding on to what you were saying, acknowledging how hard the change is, I think, is an important part of it, both for ourselves and for our students. Like, I definitely have moved through many waves of anxiety and despair, and then hope driven by my actions and driven by what other people are doing. And then it often goes back again to that fear and anxiety and worry. But I try to frame for myself that we are living in this really historically significant time where our actions really matter, and we're kind of in this time of struggle, and that the things we do now are deeply significant. And so I almost think, while for some people that might seem like it's a huge responsibility and that's too much responsibility to put on ourselves or to put on our students, I think at the same time, giving it that weight and recognizing that it is deeply important, and these changes that we're going to make are, really significant, that then gives it a lot of meaning and gives it a lot of purpose, and like acknowledging this will be hard and we're going to have to make hard choices, not shying away from that, can almost help with managing that anxiety in some ways.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. And one thing that I like to say there is, like, I think that idea of living through a historic time, I think people understand that better because of COVID. We've been told, especially as young people, that our grandkids will remember this time of COVID, or like we'll ask about it. And like even there's been like a lot of memes and TikToks about that sort of stuff, like that the history books in like 20 years will have 20 chapters on 2020. And that sort of stuff. So I think likening it to situations that students have already experienced, one being COVID, obviously, can be empowering as well, to say that, well, you've lived through a historic time, and now you can live through another historic time where we do have to make these tough choices. I think Karen or Carrie had, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, hi, I'm Carrie. So yeah, I just want to add on to that, the feeling of the despair. Yes, I'm a parent, but I'm also an educator for grades primary to 3 out of Nova Scotia. And something that I heard recently that really helped me shift how I'm living my life and sort of feel a bit more hopeful is that I was shared an Indigenous perspective that adults are borrowing the earth from the children. And that sat with me so well, because it made me think, yes, like this is how I'm going to live my life for my kids. And I'm not going to take what I want, go on big vacations and extend my house and all these things that seem rich and wonderful in there. When it's the kids that are, it's their world, it's their place to explore and enjoy. And we should give them every opportunity to appreciate the wilderness, the oceans, everything, and not destroy it for them. So hopefully that helps any of you shift your life and think about that. You are borrowing the earth from the children. Thanks.
Wonderful. Sorry, I think my video might have frozen up at the end there. Karen, was there anything you were about to add?
I don't want to add anything more. I think people are saying it just the way I was thinking about it.
Wonderful. Thank you all for this great discussion. So I'm going to zip through my slides in like the next 10 minutes, and we can have a good conversation for the last 10 minutes here. And I think everyone said it perfectly, that climate change is difficult to talk about, that people can feel hopelessness. And we've talked about some of these feelings of loss, of grief, of anxiety that we've all experienced, and me as a student, but also someone who's been working on educational programming. And I think putting that all together, it can be complicated, but it can be very rewarding when you're giving students the space to have these great conversations. So again, that's what we've tried to do with Break the Divide. And I really appreciate all the educators that are doing this on the front lines. That's where it really matters, and engaging students in these conversations. So I'd like to share a few examples of the work at Break the Divide that we've done to engage in these conversations. So I talked about that initial connection between my high school in Delta, BC, and the school that my brother was teaching at East 3 Secondary in Inuvik. And what happened in these conversations was, beyond students learning about residential schools and Inuit culture, students were learning about the concrete impacts of climate change, like how melting permafrost was leading to pipes breaking. And because of sea ice melting, elders that, or the traditional sea ice patterns that were very predictable in the past were no longer as predictable, and people were becoming injured or, even dying when going out hunting. And again, like grounding climate change in those local perspectives, in the reality that real people are facing, that's been very powerful for students to learn about. And once again, combined with that space to talk about how they're feeling openly, and providing that space to address concerns of climate denialism or political polarization or apathy for climate change. Hopefully you have students, and in these conversations we've been very fortunate. There are always some students that are hopeful, that are that know about climate change, and that understand that they are hopefully able to share their perspectives and change the minds of other students in an empathetic way, not shutting them down, because again, they're not bad faith actors. They're not like the fossil fuel industry here. They are just young people that maybe are feeling misguided or don't understand. And that's our responsibility, to have that conversation in space to foster empathy. And like we've talked about, with uh, grounding climate change in these local perspectives, and it is no longer an abstract issue. And learning from the people about this firsthand, that's been incredibly powerful. So, and I know the theme of this session is Indigenous education, and a lot of what I've talked about is kind of been in general terms, but I think uh, what we're working towards now is establishing some relationships with some First Nations here in BC and some in Alberta. And we're working on connecting youth along that same basis to have these same discussions as we did initially with those students in Inuvik. And again, we've talked a bit about empathy, this idea of learning from each other and understanding where someone else is coming from. And environmental empathy in this context is incredibly local. It's that environmental empathy that you have for your own land and for the people around you. And one thing that we've done uh, in terms of change making and climate action is in our connection between, again, a high school here in Surrey, BC, and a school in Cape Town, South Africa. As we went international, students in Canada talked to the students in Cape Town about the water crisis that they were experiencing at the time. So not only did they talk about the dynamics of climate change that caused the problem, the science behind it, the things that some students were very engaged in. They also talked about the political dimensions of it, how the South African government had seen the problem coming, but had neglected it for some time. And again, we all see the parallels there with other big problems that we see. But they also talked about like inequalities that were exacerbated by the water crisis that was going on then. So the fact that not everyone was equally impacted there. And together, the students worked to create a water crisis project where the students in South Africa went out into their communities and they interviewed students in, or young people in townships, and they talked about the water crisis there. And that created a better global minded perspective for the students in Canada and South Africa, but it also drove local action. And that's one of the most powerful things about these conversations. So what we teach students is that to become better change makers, you need to first foster empathy. You need to learn from one another and understand the complexities behind a lot of these issues that we face, like climate change. But working with people and finding your passions and using them. So for me, that's always been public speaking. I love talking to other people, and I give this example to students. And working with people on the front lines, learning about their perspectives and grounding that empathy in a local context can allow you to turn that empathy to action. And that action piece is something we're constantly building. Break the divide, we're trying to provide resources on how to foster that empathy, but also facilitate that action. Again, a lot of students wonder how to best talk about climate change. I'm under the belief that a big part of that should be connecting students with people that are impacted by climate change firsthand. And as times change, obviously, we're all going to be impacted by climate change, and we all are impacted by climate change. But it's really about bringing those perspectives to the forefront so that we can understand them. And so, as it pertains to climate change and reconciliation education, centered on personal experiences and common goals, our vision at Break the Divide really is to create this platform where any student can connect and any teacher can log on, and we can have these collaborative conversations where people are learning from one another. But ultimately, for the idea of Break the Divide obviously applies beyond just the organization. It's this idea that as young people, we can learn from each other, but as educators, we all have the responsibility to make sure that we're centering conversations on those personal experiences and that we're allowing for space for conversation. Personally, I think that's one of the most important things, giving young people the opportunity to share how they feel. And through Break the Divide, we hope to do that. And obviously, we hope to bring communities together. We hope to break down those divisions between society and create that better world that we want to be seeing. So I really appreciated everyone's time here. I would love to connect with the teachers here, all the educators. Our website is breakthedivide.net. We're on all social media. And you can also feel free to reach out to me. I'm at Abhay Sachal on Instagram, Twitter. I guess not many people, or actually, no, I shouldn't judge if any people here are on Instagram. But no, I really do appreciate everyone's time. And I'd love to answer any questions or, we can have a discussion here about some of the things that we talked about.
Wonderful. Well, as I want to say thank you for your presentation, just in case we do get into a deeper conversation. Thank you for being prepared and being open and allowing for room for harder conversations. It's hard to talk about emotions with strangers. So I do appreciate that, Abe. There's a couple of comments in the chat if you want to take a second to read through. But yeah, let's open up the floor for questions or comments now.
I would love to ask if, in your experiences, you mentioned kind of your own personal experience of how you felt disconnected from learning about Indigenous people when you were a bit younger. And I definitely noticed that my students can be interested in a lot of social justice topics, but never seem to be personally invested in Indigenous students. And I live in Vancouver and I work with quite an affluent population. And I'm wondering if you have any more insight about what you think are some of the barriers about why students don't necessarily really connect with Indigenous issues as the contemporary social justice issue today.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jasmine. I would say one thing that I want to highlight before I move on to this question is, like I talked a lot about the idea of connecting with Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples, but in that connection, I'm also very cognizant in our programming about like the history of Canada and the history of colonization, the history of extractive knowledge taking. So one of the things that we always want to focus on is like making sure that these relationships are a two-way street and people are learning from each other instead of just simply taking. Uh, and so I found that, beyond the cliche answer that I would have given like 10 minutes ago about connection, where, I think one of the things that is obviously lacking is that connection to the issue with other social justice issues. I think you can see them right in front of you. But I think the Canadian society is, or I guess just more generally, I think young people just generally don't understand the reality of a lot of the problems that we talk about when it comes to Indigenous communities. It can be disconnected. It can be this idea that it's the other as well. And I think breaking down that idea of the other, for me, when I was in the Arctic, again, it was that like I'm a Canadian. I've lived here my whole life. I grew up here in BC. I was connected with the environment, and these are my friends in the north that are also connected with the environment. Why have I never learned about like the food insecurity problems in the north or water security problems across Canada? And again, I think there has been a lot of positive change in this field. Like students, from students that I've talked to, often talk about like access to water in First Nations and how that's a big issue. And I remember being in high school that like it was a new thing that was kind of being talked about. And perhaps that's just my experience, but I think beyond that connection piece, really like focusing on things that will just engage students is another big thing. Like what sorts of stories are they being told? What sorts of articles are they reading? And I think bringing all that together, there's amazing content out there. Bringing that together is kind of what can tip the scales towards the favor of like being interested and engaged with these things.
Thanks, Abhay. There's and great question, Jasmine. There's two questions in the chat for you. One is, how do you handle bias and prejudices when connecting different groups of people? And then the second one I'm going to read just in case they're intertwined. and some people might not be following along in the chat. How many sessions do you run between each group of pen pals? How long does it take normally for students to really start opening up to each other?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question about the number of sessions. So typically we run sessions for around anywhere from like 8 to 16 weeks, sometimes longer. And we really leave it up to like the individual students that are doing it. So like I said earlier, we mostly work with high school students that are in the grade 10 to 11 range. And so by that age, a lot of students are able to kind of take the leadership upon themselves to run these programs, to like coordinate with the other community and to facilitate these dialogue sessions. So sometimes they decide to do like the entire school year, for example, connecting to each other. In terms of the so usually the conversations happen sometimes once a week, sometimes it's bi-weekly. It really depends on the schools and the number of sessions that I think it takes for students to open up to each other. One thing that I've often seen is within around 4 or 5 times of talking to each other, sometimes like 6 or 7, but usually around like 3 to 5, like especially if students are talking to the same people every time in groups of like 5 to 7 on each side, uh, it can be quite easy for students to get to know one another. And these days, everyone is connected beyond the classroom too. So students often share social media with each other, and they're texting outside the Break the Divide programming, and that's really cool to see. Uh, and in that process, they do form those friendships, but of course, it's not guaranteed. But on the back end, we're trying to do whatever we can to provide that space so that they can develop those authentic friendships and relationships. And so with that question comes like, how do we handle bias and prejudices when connecting different groups of people? And I think it really just does stem back to that idea of empathy, like allowing for students to voice their opinions, but not tolerating that, any explicit prejudice that can be harmful. So when there's any implicit bias showed, for example, as a conversation keeper or conversation guider, that's where a conversation guider often does need to step in and talk about like what the perspectives that students are talking about are rooted in, where they come from, and questioning in that sense. When there's any like explicit prejudice, like explicit racism or sexism, then that obviously needs stepping in. Fortunately, we haven't really seen that thus far. Again, we've worked with maybe around 20 or 30 different communities of schools, and so that is a bit of a smaller sample size. And as we grow, obviously we do see that as a problem, but I think we're going to be able to mitigate that with, I guess, teachers that are facilitating conversations, students that we've trained through some courses that we're actually building on how to like have good conversations, or guides that are already out there. So putting those things together, I think there's checkpoints in place to make sure that it doesn't get to a place of hostility and toxicity.
Right on, thanks. Here's another question for you. Do you find that students come in with an ingrained bias towards certain groups of people, and how do you address that? Kind of
Yeah,
linking to
that's a
what you were
really good
saying.
question. Yeah, that's a really
Yeah.
good question. And that can be more challenging compared to like a person-to-person bias that someone might experience. Like if someone is biased against an entire community of people, that can be very harmful. And again, I think what we've tried to do, we've had one experience where there have been kind of questions that have been a bit on the offensive side. And so in that process, what we really try to do is like allow students to share their experiences firsthand, allow the support needed for students that are on the receiving end too, but uh, also making it really is a fine balance between, allowing students to voice their opinions, but going too far and hurting the other students. Again, I don't really have a clear cut answer. It's kind of on a case to case basis, as again, I'm sure as educators, you will have much more knowledge than me about. But I do think that when students come in with like an ingrained bias, it's possible to kind of deprogram that bias through that conversation. Uh, I think a lot of it at the end of the day, though, does come to that foundational piece that comes in before the conversations even start. Like students really understanding the premise of these conversations, adhering to them, and respecting them. And as long as we have students with those, again, good intentions and good faith being good faith actors in the system, the rest usually does tend to work itself out. So having those foundational pieces in place, though, about like rules and guidelines and what these sorts of conversations will entail is really powerful and important.
So as you're presenting today, and some of the questions that are coming out of the chat room, and folks that have come on camera to ask, it kind of reminds me of you move to a new city, you have to make friends somewhere. You have to somehow get involved, somehow get to know people, or you go to college or university, or you start on a new sports team. There's that breaking down, like breaking the ice sort of transition period. And um, I think that that's kind of a neat spot to be in when you're meeting somebody new, but from within your own country, perhaps, or even another country that you may never ever travel to, depending on how COVID unfolds. I'm wondering for you, what do you want to do with these conversations and these? I know some people, we've dubbed them like the new age pen pals and cultural exchanges that you're working on with your foundation. What do you want to do with this next? Like, what would you see um, the next step being? People meeting in person when it's COVID safe? What would you see? More different types of action oriented projects that address climate change in various communities around the world. What are you thinking about next?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm constantly thinking about this, like, where do these conversations go? And like I said, there are other organizations out there that are addressing similar causes. I think someone in the chat mentioned an organization addressing like political polarization in the States. And that's again a very big cause, and it's important to have conversations around these things. The way I see kind of the long-term goals of Break the Divide and where it's going is more action projects. I think students, when they're connecting and when they're given the mentorship and resources and to create positive change, they will be able to do so. And I think being able to work with perhaps students that are experienced in these projects, like one thing that I often think of is this, is the idea that if one community is not very like active in climate action, for example, and they're feeling a lot of hopelessness and anxiety, but they see another community that they're connecting with that's doing advocacy, that's talking to their local MP, that's talking to their provincial government about like climate action and driving that change. Uh, as much as we can't focus on individual action and students like bearing the brunt of all of climate action, because like we don't want students to be like, I'm doing all this but it's not making a big change. I know some people mentioned that in the chat, the idea of hopelessness in light of political inaction. um, but when students are seeing other students making positive change, well, these students tend to be inspired by that and then work with them or create a related project and collaborate along that basis. So I think that process too allows for students not to always reinvent the wheel. So I think all in all, like I do see Break the Divide definitely growing beyond Canada, beyond different connections, beyond the scope of climate change too, because of the interconnectedness between all these different issues. But I think it can be a really good growth, focus on that empathy and action.
Awesome. I'm really excited to see where you take this. It's been a pleasure having you on today. On behalf of Ecom, I want to say thank you so much for spending time with us today. The group has had a lot of good questions and comments in the chat. I know that you've put up your email before. I don't know, Georgia, if you were able to type it in quickly, but if people have questions for you, or Abhay is going to do it just as fast. There you go. Who's the fastest of us all? Yeah, are you okay with people checking in with you?
Absolutely. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone, so much for the
Mhm.
conversation. I would love to stay in touch. If not for the development of Break the Divide programs, just to chat about these things. I
Mhm.
really do appreciate it. And I
All
appreciate
right.
everyone's engagement and discussion and time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We all have to head off to one more session, so we're going to cut it there. But thank you again and take care, everyone. Happy e-comming. Talk soon. Bye bye.